Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in this session about called Mixed Narratives and subtitled Outside Inside. And it will be clear, I hope, at the end of this session why the subtitle is there, the connection between the inside narratives and the outside action of museums. So I will. This is a continuation of our series that we started last year with Avi and Marsha, based on their book "Change is Required," and we're so happy that we can continue that partnership because there's so much richness in what has been done before and amazing people who have contributed to that work, and we can build on that because they have not stopped their reflection with the writing for that book that was good. So they have continued to think about these themes that they have been addressing in the book. And so we're happy to have them. Marsha is going to do a more formal introduction of who is on the panel and what you can expect. I just want to let you know that this is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website starting tomorrow. There is also closed captioning available for those who want that. You have to do that individually and on your website, on your Zoom yourself. This being said, Marsha, I think the scene is ready for you, so please take it away.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Walter. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. I just want to thank you, Walter, and Colleen and Thaddeus, I know, who are wonderfully volunteer helpers in this whole enterprise, for this opportunity. And also thanks to Roman and Littlefield and AASLH for publishing Changes Required, Preparing for the Post-Pandemic Museum in the fall of 2022. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us for this conversation. I'm coming to you from my home office in Arlington, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. I live and work on the native lands of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and Pamunkey peoples, among others, and I want to acknowledge them and pay my respects to them for their stewardship of this place. The book, Changes Required, Preparing for the Post-Pandemic Museum, grew out of a series of Zoom conversations and blogs that Avi Dechter, Ken Yellis, and I had beginning in the spring of 2020. And it's hard to believe that we're approaching the spring of 2024 at this point. But if you can remember back then, as we were listening and as we heard in our conversations with people from throughout the museum field, in all kinds of museums and all kinds of positions, those nested crises of the pandemic and the need for addressing systemic racism loomed large, affecting everyone in one way or another. Yet we also believe that the need for major change predated the murders of George Floyd and the onslaught of the pandemic. There had been many, many signals from our communities, our funders, our staff members, and other stakeholders that our prevailing museum models, including forms of leadership, stewardship, organizational hierarchies, internal processes, community engagement, needed a refresh, and they needed some changes. So what we did in the book was we invited 48 museum leaders, again, from all different areas of the sector, to do short personal essays on what kinds of change is required. And our writers had much to say. A recurrent theme warned that even post-pandemic, we cannot and should not return to, quote, normal. We needed to change. And what we'll be discussing in this conversation today is this notion of narrative, the stories that we tell. The stories that we tell both to people visiting our institutions one way or another, and to those of us who work inside our institutions. So I'm really pleased and thankful that 3 of our writers have agreed to be part of this conversation. Meredith Sorin Horsford is the executive director of the Historic House Trust of New York City. Joanne Jones-Rizzi is vice president of Science, Equity, and Education at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And Brandie Macdonald is the executive director and chief curator of the Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And I'm joined by Avi Dechter, one of the book co-editors. Our short bios are on the museum expert website. Sadly, our fourth discussant, Ben Garcia, director of the LGBTQ plus museum in New York, can't join us today because of a scheduling snafu, and he is deeply regretful that he just couldn't switch things around. So today, the three leaders that we have on this conversation will have a candid conversation on the complexity of museum narratives. How have these people adapted and facilitated new narratives? Not only those public-facing stories presented to museum visitors, but all of those inward-facing messages and practices that affect museum staff. So in her change essay, Slaves Lived Here, Esclavos Viveron Aquí, Meredith talked about transformations at her previous position, which was directorship of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in New York. Acknowledging that historic houses and history museums have long been complicit in colonialism, exploitation, and other inequities, Meredith called for a deep rethinking of everything we do in museums, from mission to operations. She said, we need a reckoning that will enable us to face past mistakes head on, as well as to find new ways to use history to understand current problems and perhaps even how to begin solving them. Brandie wrote her essay, What Keeps Me Awake at Night, a letter on decolonization, when she was senior director of decolonizing initiatives at the Museum of Us in San Diego. In it, Brandie grappled with the definitions of and relationships between decolonizing and indigenizing, and called for us to have a deeper commitment beyond performative to making both a museum priority. I firmly believe that a decolonial future will take deep and ongoing critical reflection, she wrote, both individually and collectively. So Joanne, you're our one panelist who's still at the same place you were when you wrote your essay, and we're glad you are. We know you've in so many different contexts, but especially for the pivotal role you've played in the National Traveling Exhibition, Race, Are We So Different? Your essay for change is called Word Processing. And in some ways, it's a great segue from Brandie talking about words and the power of words, because you're focusing on words inside the museum. Exploring questions about language and how the words we use in museums often contradict the systemic changes and shifts taking place within our institutions. Quote, many of the words we use are based in and support a white supremacy culture or a culture of dominance and power. Joanne urged us to pay attention to words like excellence, performance, data, and metrics to support inclusive growth and sustainable change. So I'm going to start on the outside, and we're going to, I think, quickly move holistically into our inside. But I don't know, Meredith, would you begin by just talking a little bit of how you, not only at Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, but maybe you have some observations from what you're doing in your new position about shaping or reshaping the primary external narrative of your organization.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for having me. As Marcia mentioned, when I was working on my chapter of this book, I was the director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in Upper Manhattan at the time. And obviously it was a challenging time for everyone, and we were really grappling, as was everyone, with trying to figure out how to engage people at a time when we were physically closed to the public. But prior to the pandemic, we had really been doing a lot of thinking about the narratives that we told at the museum. The story when I got there was, let's talk about the Dyckmans. They came to this country from the Netherlands. they amassed 250 acres of land in what we now call Upper Manhattan, but was then rural countryside. And they farmed all of this land on their own by some sort of miracle. And that's how they became wealthy. And let's talk about how great they are. And while that might be a portion of the story, it was very clearly not all of the story. And so we wrote a grant to the New York Community Trust several years before the pandemic to hire a research assistant, because the Dykmans didn't really save a lot of documentation that showed that they treated people like cattle. So it was very hard to find that information. And so we hired a research assistant and really started working on changing our narrative to be more realistic, more inclusive, and to actually focus on the people that the Dykmans enslaved and call them by name and humanize them and talk about Hannah and what we knew about Hannah and her role in the house, etc. And so that started to get infused throughout all of our programming, everything that we did. And that was sort of how we made a big shift that, people who lived across the street for 30 years reached out and said, wow, I wish you guys had been doing this 30 years ago. I've lived in this neighborhood across the street for all these years. I've never gone to the museum because didn't feel like there was anything for me. And now I want to come to everything you do. So it really changed how we engage with our community and the stories that we tell.
Thank you very much. How about Joanne? I know we're going to talk about, you talked a lot about inside, but what about your role in programmatic narratives and in what's happened at the museum?
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody. And it's really a great pleasure for me to be with all of you. Sadly not in person, but this will do. Well, I think they're really connected. In my, I think the external work that we do always should mirror what's happening internally. And when they don't, I think we run into problems. And what I mean by that is, if we have an external message, we welcome everyone, all of the platitudes that I think many museums are a part of do. And, we welcome everyone. We have all these practices that support inclusion. We want everybody to feel belonging. We want everybody to be seen. We want everybody to see themselves. I think that that it's very challenging and it's really hard for museums to communicate, to have that external presence and have people actually feel that it's authentic unless it is happening internally. And the internal work, as we know, it can be really challenging and is really hard. And it is something that doesn't just happen with a couple of initiatives. It's something that it has to be deeply embedded in an organization. And I always say, and my colleagues, like this, the work that we're doing, the dismantling white supremacy culture, the work that we're doing around belonging, the work that we're doing around having people feel seen here is work of the whole institution. It's not one department. It's not. It's everybody, and from the president to everybody who's working here, to the trustees, and it's. I would say that it's slow. It's really slow going, and even in places, I feel very fortunate. I'm in a place where the president and the trustees and many people in the museum believe this, practice it, work every day to bring it to life. And it's still a challenge, and we still make mistakes. We still have mishaps. We do things come up, and it's hard. And yet all of that process. The museum we have 3 values of learning, collaboration, and equity. And those values, we try to live those values. Everybody, every department has those values. The museum has those values. We talk about them all the time. And we don't always get it right. There are mishaps. And the way that, and sometimes the mishaps, we all know that when you make a mistake, and when you make a mistake around these kinds of, in these areas, it's really painful, and people just want to never do anything again. They say, I'm never doing this work again. I'm not, and that's the best kind of learning. And we have to not because it's not at all at the expense of somebody else, but just the learning that takes place internally when you make a mistake, especially around, using a term that is offensive, having a program that is offensive, writing a label that might be offensive. Those are the things, the ability and willingness to say, we got it wrong, we're trying to make it right, I think can be a powerful thing. I think institutions don't do it enough. We're not perfect. And there are people who are running museums. They don't exist outside of communities. They don't exist. They exist because we're in them. We're making decisions. So that's a long answer. I hope I answered your question.
No, yeah, thank you. And actually, Brandie, when you wrote your piece, What Keeps You Up at Night, and you were at the Museum of Us, and now you're at a new museum, and some of the themes that we've heard both from Meredith and Joanne about, it takes time. And I loved, you used a metaphor in your essay of water in terms of a drip drip, but a drip drip over time can really make a big difference. So I just wondered, I'd love your reflections on this whole notion of words and the role of people inside and outside the museum. Even go ahead. I have lots of things I wanted to ask you.
Thanks, Marcia. First, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be in this space. I have so much respect and admiration for Meredith and Joanne. And so it's just such a gift to be able to share space with you all and be in conversation, and then to see Marcia and Avi again, and that people are showing up. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here with us. So I am in a new space. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana. I think words are powerful. Words consistently resonate. So how we use words, I think in terms of how we talk about ourselves is, and it can change over time, but I think is thinking about relevancy. How are we relevant in the community? I think at the Museum of Us, we heard quite a bit from communities of, why aren't you talking about your colonizers on your facade? Why we don't see ourselves within the exhibits, even though you're a museum of being humans or of humans. I think that's also very relatable to, even though we don't have colonizers on the facade at Bloomington, Indiana, it's a very brutalism architecture, but it's very much the same. We've heard very similar in terms of, it was a very object-based space. Some of the stories, we also had 2 institutions that came together as one, where it was an archaeology research lab and a museum of world culture that then was joined. And now we're working to open. And so a lot of the pieces, when we think about externally in the conversations in terms of how do we be relevant, where people actually want to come in, not because it's a class assignment, or because they are just like need to use the restroom or something like that, is one of the things that we want to shift that paradigm of making sure that we're creating a space and that people feel welcome, that even if a student or anyone wants to come and fall asleep on the big comfy chair, then that's a space that they feel safe in, right? And I think that that's really powerful, in addition to coming and see the exhibits, that they can see themselves, see other folks, and that it is a space where we uplift and steward people's stories. And I think that those are these shifts, large and small shifts, in terms of how do we cultivate a space of welcoming, of being seen, of validating people's truths. And I think that is through words, but it's also in terms of how we create spaces of generosity. And so that's kind of where we're moving right now with this institution, is and the organization is also being in a very colonial white supremacy it's an academic space. Like, it has a deep-seated history of that. How do you decolonize? Can you decolonize a space? Can you, like, how do you work towards countering the white supremacy embedded? It's an anthropology space as well. So there's all these layers of history. And it's complicated because not only do museums move slow, but academics also move slow. And so I think it's just trying to find these entry points. And so I think what I've heard too is that it is internal work. What I heard Joanne talk about, what I heard Meredith talk about is, and that's kind of us, the staff are really important. We're building our team as well because it's a new museum. And so thinking really critically about how we're building that paradigm shift together. So it is collective ownership, that it's not just my job, but it's everybody's job. And so we're thinking critically around how the staff can come together to plan this, and to start thinking about other people's departments, but also their own, around what some of these values mean. What are some of the shifts? What does that timeline look like? And if we need to also partner with external spaces. It's just a slow process, and we're working to open in October. So even thinking about honoring community stories. Yeah.
So will that be an exhibition, that a new exhibition that will open your space in October?
It's going to be a lot of new exhibitions. We have a large exhibit hall, which will have 3. And so I think one of the things that we're thinking, and that I'm working with the team and externally with the team, is changing the ways that even faculty and the community see us. And so getting the faculty that work at IU excited about seeing their data, but also recognizing the ways in which that their research and the communities that they represent, that the focus of kind of how does that translate to a museum? What is our responsibility to uplift stories and communities' voices and their stories within this museum, versus it just being data and text panels? Is it an interactive, but also are we making sure that people's stories are honored and they're getting paid for their stories as well if they want to get paid? So I think there's going to be a variety of different spaces that we're still planning out, and we're also working on building the team at the same time. It's a tight timeline, but I think it's coming together.
That's good. Thank you so much. And, you know, Meredith, when you were at the Dyckman Farm Museum in your piece, you also talked about social media, the expectations of audiences for new technologies, and art, the work, you know, the work of art in a historic house or history museum, and where you even projected it. Maybe you want to say a little about that, but also I'm curious about the kinds of changed narratives that you're working on with now this whole network of historic properties that you're in charge of.
Sure. Well, we found that one of the easier ways to engage visitors in a conversation about the topic of enslavement in this example at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum was through art. We would often bring in contemporary artists that were local in what is the last affordable neighborhood in Manhattan. And there were a lot of artists living there, but there was no place in the community for them to exhibit their art. They had to go downtown somewhere. So we started exhibiting their work at the museum and found that if we put out a call for artists and provided them with all of the research that we had on enslavement in Upper Manhattan, enslavement at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, that they could create something amazing that was really an entry point into conversations with the community about these topics, even though it can be a bit of a challenging topic and a bit of a challenging conversation to have. So we found that to be really useful and a really wonderful sort of entry point into just having dialogue with our community. Certainly through social media, you get any and every piece of feedback, whether you're looking for it or not. And after we did a whole host of contemporary art installations and a lot of programming, including the projection on the side of the museum that we did that said slaves lived here in English and Spanish, we got 1,000,001. This is amazing. I love that this is what you're doing as an institution. You know, this makes me want to come here, even though I haven't been there since 4th grade. And then we got a few of the, is this all you're going to talk about? Is there anything else that you guys do? This is like, it's over, move on. It was in the past. But those are from internet trolls. So, you know, it was an interesting kind of engagement and dialogue, but the majority of the people that we interacted with and the people who actually had the guts to come to the museum were really supportive and felt really engaged because they were involved throughout the entire process. It wasn't just, oh, this is what we're putting on you and you're gonna like it. You're gonna come and see it and you're gonna engage with it. You know, they were involved throughout the entire process. So, you know, it was easy for them to think, you know, oh yeah, I'm into this. I came to meetings, I gave my feedback, you know, so that was really a great process. And now that I'm at the Historic House Trust of New York City, we oversee and steward 23 different historic house museums that are in all 5 boroughs of New York City. We're seeing that a lot of our house partners are either newly embarking on or are sort of in the process of really rethinking their narratives, thinking about, you know, what are the stories that we tell here and why are we just talking about European history? You know, so what other stories are there to be told? And so it's really an exciting place for me to be now, engaging with all of these different historic sites, like Reimagine Lefferts in Brooklyn, where they for many years interpreted the story of the Lefferts family, and they farmed, and you know, another kind of Dutch farm. And so it's really exciting to see that they've completely restored the house, and that they're now embarking on thinking about engaging the community and telling new stories, and also thinking about who's their present day community, right? And how are you engaging them in the history that you are telling? So it's very exciting.
Well, and I know when you were at Dyckman Farm, you talked a lot about the neighbors, and you implied that. So and I wonder, you know, another point you made, which interests me, is how can you evoke history to address present day issues and problems? And um, are people all on board with that? I mean, and do you have any example to use?
I think so. I think for the most part, yes. During the pandemic, one of the other things that we started doing was a lecture series that was virtual, obviously, because we were all at home. And the focus was all about race and thinking about, you know, we had historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, artists, you name it. We had so many people who come to speak from their experienced vantage point about race and what does that mean. And think that felt like, again, almost an easy entry point into the conversation, right? Because you're having someone come and say, this is what I teach in, you know, in a university setting. This is the research that I've done, you know, and it allowed people who attended, who, again, this was virtual. So people were attending from the Netherlands, California, right down the block from the museum. And it allowed everyone to really interact with these people and ask questions in a really comfortable way. So I think that, you know, there are some interesting ways to engage people and get feedback from them in a way that feels comfortable, not threatening, not aggressive, just really
That's
calm.
that's great to hear. I think we're at a point. I mean, even though you wrote your essays a while ago, with what's going on in our culture now, there's even more, I think, sensitivity to words and how they're used. So I really welcome the kind of patience that I think all 3 of you have learned and applied in terms of the change. I wonder, Brandie, you know, here in Washington, there are front page stories about the Smithsonian and human remains and all of these issues around who gets to tell the story and who speaks for what things. I don't know what the situation is in your new museum, but how does that work with you in terms of your engagement with, I would assume, not only your academic community, but the various Native communities who are represented in your collections?
Change takes time. Change can be really uncomfortable for people that are not used to change. And sitting in discomfort is not something that everybody is used to doing. And I think that we as museums have held these spaces of pillars where we have not changed for some time, and we have needed to, or Many museums haven't. I think other museums have embraced it differently. And so when I think about some of the news, like I think you're talking in terms of like the new NAGPRA regulations that have really issued large scale change for museums across the board. And even just thinking about with the Smithsonian's regulations around shared stewardship policy, that is also creating an echo, because now you're looking at what is the practice behind that policy for those institutions. And I'm not quite sure where that's led, but I do think the policy was written in a way that it was really collaborative, but also recognizing the need for change and the need to think about restitution and repatriation. And so I'm really excited about this change. I know that it adds additional layers to the work. And I think that we've heard from some, and I don't speak for all Native people, but I think we've heard from some Indigenous communities that this can add additional challenges in terms, just because of the timelines and also thinking about just capacity. But we've also heard that this is something that Indigenous communities have been asking for because museums have not responded. And so I'm excited to see how this pushes museums to act. And we see this in a variety of spaces because what it does is it has us make sure that as museum professionals and as an Indigenous person in a museum, it makes me excited that now we have policy that says that Indigenous people define what accessibility is and what the authority and how we tell their stories and how those items are on display and what is a cultural item. And so I think that there are some spaces that are a little gray that can present some challenges, because I think definitions are really important for both policy, but us and museums when we think about words, like how are we defining that? Because then we have some clearer guiding posts. But I think that these types of things really create an entry point and an open door and that forces a lot of people to change. And so I'm looking forward to what that means within the next 4 or 5 years or in 10 years or decades down the road. And I also think that there needs to be opportunity for growth, because it's such a limited space of pushed change in terms of what that looks like for federally recognized Indigenous communities. But I think when we look at the spaces of oppression and white supremacy and the impacts of colonization, it's with Black Indigenous communities of color. And I don't think that we have laws and policies that support that kind of change. And I think that that's where I'd like us to see to continue to move forward, because that museums need to recognize, like all of those spaces and those community members, that there's harm perpetrated against them and their ancestors and their future generations.
Thank you. I mean, I think from what I read, not necessarily in the museum literature, but other literature, there's a lot of pushback against some of the strides that have been made. And Joanne, I guess I want to go to you on that, because I think, your opening comments, which were about empathy, right? They were about recognizing that mistakes get made and people can feel bad, but how do you keep moving on and create those spaces where you can move on? I when you wrote about things like standards of excellence, and how we and Brandie referred a little bit to this too, the way we currently discuss things and the words we use and how we separate sometimes what our convictions are from just the way you'll have a meeting, the power dynamics that are implicit in so many of our structures. How do we deal with the world right now? We're 4 years past the onset of COVID.
And we also know that this pandemic, it's been a horrific time for globally, and it's been a horrific time for cultural institutions like museums. And we are constantly, we're very mindful of, like, what is the attendance and what is, we depend on that. And I think so that's just another layer that's there. But I think this question about accountability and being held accountable by our audiences, by the staff. I'm in a leadership position, so I mean, being held accountable to the decisions that we make. And I think this question about, and all the NAGPRA, these new regulations, in some ways it puts much more onus on the institutions and it is a way of accountability. And it's You said something, Marcia, that we were patient. I think you used that, and I don't feel very patient. I think I'm impatient. Things do take, they move at a snail's pace. So it's challenging. I mean, it is challenging, I think, and I think empathy is really important. I don't know that most people, I mean, I think people are the kind of conversations that are happening, both politically, socially, people aren't very patient, and people are hold institutions like museums responsible for a lot more than, we have influence. We're influencers, so we can be, and hopefully we can be influencers in a good way. I'm trying to stay on track with your prompt, Marcia, and not kind of wander off in some other Netherland. I think that when you said something, Meredith, about an internet troll, and it made me think about when we first opened the race exhibition in 2007. And there was a lot, we did a lot internally, and we did a lot of preparation, and kind of preparing the staff, preparing, trying to respond, kind of preempt what could happen and how visitors might react to things that they saw, or to the basic premise of the exhibition, which is that race is a social construct, that it doesn't exist, and of course we know that it does exist. So there's these juxtaposition of these two ideas. There were, like, the internet, social media was at a really different place in 2007, and conversations about race were at a really different place nationally in 2007 than we are now. And and now when I think about kind of the responses that we get, the kind of social media reactions that we have to things that we do, to critique of programs and exhibitions, it's really it's the internet, and the kind of the culture of social media has really shifted, I think, our relationship in some ways to audiences. And I'm reluctant to say to communities, because that feels too general. But I do think the social media has really, it can be really great. It can be really great. And there are people who use it in ways that are really damaging. And so that balance of finding ways, because I don't think it should be, I don't think it should be ignored. I think, we have to pay attention to what people are saying, even sometimes when, then there are people who maybe we should ignore. It's hard for me to ignore those people, I have to say. So I'm not on very much social media, because I have a hard time putting it aside, and sometimes the negative voices are much louder, or the critiquing voices, when there's not a lot of analysis or deep thinking behind the critique, when it's pretty much based in hate. I think that's hard. I know I didn't answer your question, Marcia, but
No, you did. I mean, I think that I was curious. I'm curious especially about this notion of metrics of what we measure in our museums. And I know
Yeah.
you've been through a process, Joanne, at the Science Museum, of looking inside, not just looking at the role, how the race exhibit has been received. You want to say just a couple of things about
Sure.
that?
Yes, we have, we're very fortunate. We have research and evaluation and learning department here at the museum, where we have wonderful, thoughtful people who I've learned a lot from about evaluation. But we're trying to understand our impact. and trying to understand our impact both in schools with visitors, people's responses to different topics, people's responses to different exhibitions. And, you know, I'm mixed about it because, and I have to say, staff that I'm working with in research and evaluation, I've learned a lot. And I've learned, because I think my initial feeling is like, can't measure these are the kinds of things that you're trying to measure are too hard to measure. People shouldn't, but they are really thoughtful. And the kinds of questions, and it's complicated. So we have done a staff survey here, when we do it 3 or 4 times a year. And it's really hard to be anonymous if you're a brown or black person in our museum. And our numbers are pretty good. We have a pretty diverse group of people, but people know who is, you know, you're reading these comments, you know who's who. And so sometimes I think this quality, this need for us as museums to measure impact and to measure all these. So the fact that we do it and that we rely on these metrics in the way that we do, I sometimes, you know, I resist, but I also see the value. And I think there's a lot to be said in doing it with a kind of awareness and consciousness about the kinds of how you ask certain questions, how you and then what you do with that data and how you use that data, I think is also really important. So I'm not, I've softened a little bit about measuring, even though I think in the hands of the wrong people, it can be really damaging.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know whether, Brandie, when you were at Museum of Us, did you get into conversations, especially as you transitioned from Museum of Man to Museum of Us? Did you get into conversations around shifting notions of evaluation or metrics?
So with the rebranding, I think that there was a lot of conversation because we had been talking about it for a while at that museum. Even from the 70s, they had been talking about it. So that was way even before my time or before the executive director, Micah Parsons' time. And so there was data collected where people were upset. There wasn't necessarily social media yet, but we did have news articles where people were angry and would write their little blurb in a newspaper. And so I think one of the things that we were really intentional, even because we started before the pandemic and then the name changed in the midst of the pandemic. We're really intentional about collecting information and asking folks what did they think. And I think, and Meredith even talked about like engaging in dialogue, really important. And I think that is in a lot of things that we do, when we think about impact, I think that dialogue, and I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, is so important. And collecting that information and when we got to the space where we were ready to change, and when we did change the name, we definitely had the internet trolls and Tucker Carlson and Tucker Carlson squad that came after us. And also people were like, you didn't ask us. Why? You didn't even ask any of us. But we were able to come back and say, actually, we did. We even did it in a physical space and in a digital space. And so I think one of the things that we tried to do was, and that you can see in the space now that I really appreciated with the team, was really, we asked the team to think creatively around how do we continue to talk about this, both in a digital space, but also in a physical space. And so then we did a small little physical exhibit that has a QR code that has information around the timeline to show that the name did change. We had the old sign up that was inside of the museum, but then we also did a Google Arts and Culture exhibit that also talked about that brought in that historical piece of information. So for a variety of different touch points. And then we consistently continue to talk about it on social media. But I think that the marketing was really that transition of that I keep hearing us kind of talk about when we think about making people feel seen, be seen, that this is about communities in a variety of ways. And that was part of the name change, was to recognize that and to use that creativity of the name change and the phasing of the name change to make sure that we're thinking about, it was like from us. And so like read with us, or I think there was another one was like meditate with us. So it was really trying to find new ways to continue to bring folks in. And then we thought creatively around what that means around impact. Are we just looking at a revenue space as just the impact? Is it really quantitative? Is it like 100 people is what we're going for? Or are we really thinking about coming through and the impact that we make on a variety of folks and how that, well, we can't necessarily always measure that in resonating at home. But if we're thinking about humans, it is thinking kind of deeper in terms of how do we engage in the connections that we build.
Great, thank you. And Meredith, I don't know what the expectations are for you, with especially in your new gig, about impact and measuring impact. And we only have about 10 more minutes. I want to leave time for questions, but I'd like to hear just briefly, how you're thinking about that.
Sure. So the setup at the Historic House Trust is interesting in that we don't run any of the historic sites. We have partner nonprofit organizations that operate all of them, manage all of the museum functions, do their own fundraising, et cetera. And we are sort of we're the sort of liaison between those separate nonprofit organizations and the Parks Department, the New York City Parks Department, who actually owns the buildings, the land, et cetera. So not only are they kind of operating their own nonprofits, we also provide nonprofit support to them. And then we also manage all of the capital projects, make sure maintenance is happening, et cetera, et cetera. So we're doing a lot of preservation work. It's interesting to see the evolution of a lot of these historic house museums and the evolution of their boards and their staffs, because I do think, as we talk a lot about how our narratives change, I think our narrative has to change everywhere, not just in the way that we're talking to visitors. But so it's interesting to see that on different levels, because all of our organizations are in different boroughs, serving different communities of different sizes and at different stages of growth in their own kind of nonprofit life cycle. So we don't dictate that, but it's great to be a support system, to be a colleague, to be a partner in that sort of evolution in whatever way makes sense for that organization, right? We're not forcing anyone to say, think about your interpretation, start bringing some new things to the table. But I think that the more that we provide resources and support and collaboration amongst one another, I think the more that people are apt to think, well, hey, maybe I should start to think about, how we evolve and, what we're doing next. And I mean, a lot of our partners are already doing that work. So it's really exciting to see. And then obviously they know that the work that I did at Dykeman. And so some of our partners have come to me and said, hey, did you ever encounter this? We're working on this. This is the challenge we're experiencing. So it's great to have that sort of back and forth with everyone.
Thank you. I mean, that's a great segue. I think, Avi, I'm just going to ask you to make a couple of remarks and then we'll answer some questions. I think that's one of the reasons Museum Expert exists, I think, is to nurture and build our community, especially where, it can be you can feel pretty alone sometimes if you're operating just in one single institution. So Avi, why don't you make a few comments?
Thanks very much, Marcia. First of all, thank you to Museum Expert for hosting us today. Thanks to our three panelists. It's been wonderful, wide-ranging and deep-thinking conversation. And thanks to the participants. I've been following the chat as a parallel conversation, and some of the questions have been pretty profound and wonderful. Good to take away with you. I want to begin with the idea of agency. That's come up in several of the chats and also implicitly in our conversation today. If there's one thing that we need more than anything else, it's a sense of our own agency. I believe that a lot of us are inhibited by the feeling that we really can't do certain things, when in fact we can do them. We just haven't tried to do them yet. And I worry about that in context of museums particularly. Museums are remarkably permeable institutions. We who are inside them don't always see that. But if you look at other kinds of institutions, museums are really remarkably open to ideas and change and personality and above all, our personal agency. And secondly, right along with that, if we want our agency to really have effect, the first thing I can recommend to everybody in the room is that you find yourself a partner. This goes all the way back to the ancient prophets in the Bible, who said they came together to do the work, and each one said to the other, be courageous. And that's exactly what you need to exert your agency. It's just a bit of courage, and to maximize that, you really want a partner. It was Elie Wiesel, the Nobelist, who said that we live by stories. Stories tell us who we are and who we aspire to be, what is normal and what is aberrant, what we value and what we deplore. And I think that it has been emphasized by everybody today that the language we use and the stories we tell are absolutely critical. And this imposes on us a fundamental responsibility, and that is to question regularly what those words and stories are. This is not to be taken for granted. They are not fixed. Words change their meaning. Institutions change the values they place on different language. Our audiences place different values on the language. We need to be conscious all the time of the words and language that we are using. And of course, those stories, as has been remarked, need to connect inside and outside. The stories do not belong solely to the community and we borrow them, and they certainly don't belong solely to the museum and we share them with our audiences. They belong to both the community and to the institution. And therefore, we have to be in partnership in developing the stories that we choose to tell, and we need to be able to talk together about those stories. That means fundamentally a major investment by our institutions in the relationships with our community, externally, and internally. We need to make sure that the voices within our own institution are heard at the table, not after the fact, but at the table when the decisions and choices are being made. Reflection is something that we don't pay enough attention to in our museums. We need to invest in reflection. And we also need, of course, to invest in experimentation. One of the nicest pieces of news I can bring is the work goes slowly. Brandie made a point of that in her essay, and again today, it's absolutely true. It does go slowly. But what is remarkable is that when you start to make change, it builds momentum. A small step leads to a slightly bigger step to a bigger one still. And eventually, by the way, this begins to overcome institutional inertia, including inertia among the leadership. Board members may not buy wholesale change without close inspection, but small changes that happen at the margins and the periphery can be powerful instruments for change later on in the heart and core of the institution's mission. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Avi. Thaddeus, do you have any questions that we can at least dip our toes into?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody in the chat for a lot of really great questions there. And the last things that Avi was saying gets to some of the first questions I wanted to make sure we touched on, because we had multiple people who were asking some variation. Brianne, Katie, Elizabeth, Sarah also seconded Brianne's question, all had questions that had to deal with suggesting strategies for gaining support from leadership, or getting support from a board, having to work with hierarchical structures, what to do if a leadership team is on the more risk-averse side. Avi touched on that a little bit with that idea of making those small incremental changes. But does anybody else have anything they'd like to add about that kind of strategic way to approach the leadership of your museums?
I'm happy to.
Oh, thanks, Meredith.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Was that somebody else going to go? No? Okay. Well, one way that I think is maybe a slightly sneaky way to approach things is to see where the funding is, and think about, okay, what would be the first kind of step for you, your first phase into doing this work? And can you find a funder that would be interested in supporting this work? Because once you get a funder engaged and they want to give you $50,000 to do this research, or to, you know, put together an exhibition or bring together thought leaders or whatever it is that you want to do, that's hard to turn down and walk away from. And maybe that is something along the lines of Avi's, you know, make small incremental steps. Doesn't have to be like we're doing a massive overhaul, but, you know, maybe start to think about, maybe we start with this. The other thing that I think is helpful just as a museum professional is to, you know, find those examples out there of other institutions that are doing the kinds of work that, you know, you think your institution should be doing, and start talking to them about how did you do it? What worked for you? Do you have any, you know, horror stories or happy stories or anything that could be helpful?
Can I toss in one thought, and that is the single best resource I have found over the years for new ideas is reading the daily paper.
We once funded a project way back in the day at Colonial Williamsburg, which was actually a daily game show that was based on a story in the daily paper. You know, someone threw a rock through a window. How should they be treated? And so the of course, this sounds terrible now, but you know, it was like the founding fathers, some of the interpreters addressed that issue, both from a contemporary point of view and from a historical point of view.
Can I just also add, because I think is the power of the small steps, it may feel small to you, but it's actually, it can be really big to someone else in other communities. And I think that nothing is too small, and thinking about where do you have the power to shift and where do you have the power to create change and to create that impact that you're looking for. And I also think that data is incredibly valuable and important to be able to leverage those changes with your administration. And so thinking about data in a variety of different spaces of who are the people, if our students is your public asking you about this, collect that information. If you're getting information on your social media or a variety of different in tours because people are demanding and asking where are these items coming from, why aren't you more relevant, that's valuable information that then you can collect, present to your leadership, because that's what will then also continue to create that catalyst for change. And then thinking about other folks within, I think we talked about the other folks in the field and the network, but if you find other people at similar places and you know that they're friends or that they're in the same network, maybe you can like foster a coffee session or a discussion, and then they can talk about and see how they can also provide more information about the impact. Because sometimes I think there's a fear involved about that change or of losing funders. But there's a lot of funders out there. There's a lot of folks out there. And so even is figuring out how do you just create that inch, because no change is too small. It's just, I think that that's really important. And you have the power. It goes back to the drip situation. Like we have a lot of power. It's just finding the spaces that we have power and not minimizing the power that we have.
Yeah. Drip by drip.
Yeah, that's really great, really helpful stuff there towards that question. I think we're going to try to get through one or two others real quickly. There was a question from Katie for Joanna. Have you found exciting pedagogies that incorporate cultural inclusivity and transform perspectives into STEM education? I would love to know what you are reading and looking at in the moment to inform your work.
Well, there's a there's a lot, and I'm happy to talk with you offline. What comes to mind initially is the work of Louise Moll, who has this theoretical framework called funds of knowledge, and we've actually he grew out of work that people were doing in New Mexico, I think, and it grew out of literacy and looking at and working with students and seeing students who were English was not their first language, or whose parents were not hadn't gone to school, not doing well in school, in traditional, in a classroom around language arts primarily. And so he developed this theory. He started visiting students in their homes, which is unheard of now, but this wasn't that long ago. But and saw that these students in their home lives were really high functioning. They were helping their parents, and they were working in stores. They were using skills that you needed to do well in school, but the way that the curriculum was developed was not aligned with their cultural values and their funds of knowledge. So we've kind of adapted that. I've tried many times. I think maybe 5 times. I finally was told no more. I've submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation to look at our collection around this idea of what I called science funds of knowledge, because I think that in some ways how science is taught and how STEM is perceived is from a pretty traditional, a white framing. And so it hasn't gotten funded. We still use, we think about it all the time, and we use it in our thinking and in our ways that we kind of approach the work. But it is, so that's just one example. Check it out, Luis Moll. I think it's Moll, and fantastic. It's wonderful, wonderful work, and it's being used in a lot of schools now. When I wrote this proposal, this was probably 10 years ago, when I was on my quest to get it funded. People didn't know much about it, and it wasn't being used, but now as a kind of theoretical educational framing, people are using it.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Last question, please.
Yeah, so Jose had a really good question about professionals asking themselves the question of to whom does the museum belong, creating new language to express that identity. I think Brandie covered that pretty well. I had some similar questions myself along those lines, especially as somebody who grew up in San Diego, going to the Museum of Man. So I think if that's been addressed pretty well already. So the only other questions that have really come up have to do with evaluation, about how tricky it is, and just if there are any examples of what that looks like in terms of how it has had to be reworked for your teams.
I urge people, the department here at the Science Museum is the Department of Research, Evaluation, and Learning. Marjorie Baquette is the director of that program, and there are a number of her staff who are equally as skilled, and she is very happy to talk with people about the work. And so there's a plug for Marjorie and the work of research and evaluation here at the Science Museum.
And Thaddeus, maybe that can be the topic of our next museum expert webinar, because it's a pretty deep.
It's a big topic. Yeah.
And
it is.
Yeah. There's some really interesting new and important work, I think, being done.
Yeah. Yep.
Especially around the sort of colonialist white power dimensions of it that sometimes they're unconscious.
Well, thank you all for this very vivid conversation and the chat, what's going on there. I know that people were looking how to keep the chat, and for those who don't know, when you look at the bottom of the page of the chat, there are like 3 dots there. If you click on there, you have an option to save the chat, so you will be able to reflect on that later on. Thanks, Abby and Marsha, for this new amazing program that you brought to us here. Thanks to the panelists for your insights, and to the museum expert team for making this all possible as usual. So we're looking forward to the next session with you, and maybe it's evaluation, but it could be something else as well. I just want to remind everyone that we alternate this series with our own museum expert series about community in the workplace, how to build community in the workplace, and some of the things are really much related to what we have heard today. But our next step in the month of March, in a couple of weeks, will be to address what are the barriers and the challenges inside of museums that prevent institutions to build community and to come together around what is a human-centered workplace. And I hope you will be there to discuss that with us. So thanks for now, and I hope to see you all the next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Nice to meet everybody.
You
Thank
too.
you.